Richard Bradley, Professor of Philosophy at LSE. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Let's first talk about your field of research. So how would you describe your field of research?
Well, I would call myself a decision theorist, but maybe more specifically a philosophical decision theorist, because that does sort of mark me out a little bit amongst the various people who work in decision theory.
And what are the central questions your field tackles concerning decision making and uncertainty in particular?
Okay. So, the field is very broadly broken up into two big groups. There are the people who study how human beings and other sort of agents, sometimes animals, group agents, robots, and so on, make decisions in various situations when faced with various kinds of alternatives. And these people are sort of interested in getting an accurate description and explanation of what they observe in the way of choices that people make. The other group, that's the sort of descriptive decision theorists. The other group are the normative decision theorists, and they're asking a very different question. They're sort of saying, forget about how people actually make decisions. How should they make decisions, given the sorts of things that they ought to be interested in, given what they know, given what their options are, what's feasible, what's moral, practical. So it can play around with a lot of parameters, but really it's all organized around that sort of single question: what should this person, agent do?
Okay. So let's just talk about that normative question then, because that's what we're interested in here. Are there any standardly accepted replies in your field?
Yeah, so in philosophical decision theory, there's very clearly a reply that you will always get as the first answer to this question, and it's known as sort of maximizing expected benefit or maximizing expected utility, or some version of those terms. And what this theory broadly says is, look, if you're facing a decision problem, you need to work out what the various possible states of the world are, what your environment looks like, what possible features it might have. And it's usually assumed that you aren't quite sure about what these possible features are. You have some beliefs about them, but you don't know which of these you don't know whether these beliefs are true, and so on. And then you work out for each of the possible actions that you have before you, let's call these your option set, what the consequence of performing that action is in each of the possible states of the world. So that's sort of how we'd start out sort of describing, in a very abstract way, a decision problem. And the thought is that formula, that way of describing it, is sufficiently abstract that it covers really a lot of different kinds of decisions. And then let's call it the default theory, says what you should do now is you should think about the relative probability of all the possible states of the world and attach probabilities to each possible state. You should also attach some kind of number to each of the possible consequences of your actions in each state. Let's call that a utility to fit with standard usage. And then what you should do is try and work out what the maximum expected utility of each action is. And broadly, what you're doing there is you're looking at the utilities of each of the possible consequences and weighing each of them by the probability of them occurring, given that you perform the action in question. Having done that, worked out the expected utility of each of the actions available to you, simply do the one with the highest. That's maximization of expected utility.
Okay. What sort of reasons or arguments are given in favor of that sort of reply?
Right. So there's people give a variety of different arguments in favor of them, but most of these arguments are really of one of two sorts. One sort is a kind of argument that shows that unless you follow this sort of rule, then life is going to go worse for you. And this sort of argument will usually take is sort of look at some kind of toy version, some sort of prototypical setup, and sort of explain what can go wrong, ways in which sort of life might go worse for you if you don't do this. The other sort of, let's say, call it the sort of more foundational way of approaching this is to think about what principles we can write down characterizing the things we would like, the properties we would like our decision rule to have. And so we sort of write down all the, whatever we can think of here. And then you try and show that if a rule respects all of these properties, then it's expected utility in effect, or maybe it's expected utility is one of those that satisfy them, depending on how many you write down. And there are some very, very important results in the field. I mean, the sort of thing that everybody who studies this field, is forced to confront at some point, showing precisely what set of conditions are sufficient to tell you, sufficient for us to say, look, anybody who's employing a rule that satisfies these conditions is really behaving as if they're maximizing expected utility. And from that, we're supposed to infer, but you can see there's a little bit of a step that needs to be taken here, that if you're wanting, if you don't have a choice rule to hand yet and you're wondering what you should do, this is the one you should pick, because you know that whatever you pick, it will either be in effect this or something that's not as good.
Okay. So we've talked about your field and what it has to say in the normative issue. I'd like to move on to your own personal view on these sorts of issues.
Right. So, my view is that this theory that we've just described, the so-called maximization of expected utility theory, really does provide the correct answer to the question of what should I do in a very broad range of cases. But there are cases that have some special characteristics, and in a lot of my work I explore what happens when those conditions don't actually hold. So some of the important ones here are, for instance, you have to be able to set up your decision problem in the way that I described. You have to be able to identify what all the possible states of the world are, and then you have to be able to identify what actions are available to you, and you have to be able to identify for each of them what its outcome is. So that's one set of things that you have to do, and you can already see that there's lots of things that might go wrong here. You might worry that there are sort of characteristics of the state of the world that you haven't thought of. You might wonder whether you're describing them sufficiently precisely in order to take a reasonable attitude to them. You might really have no idea what actions are available to you. And you might, in particular, wonder whether, at least sometime in the future, things might become available to you that you can't imagine now. This is sort of the problem of technological advances, it's sometimes called. And then finally, typically it's actually very hard to say, with the sort of level of precision that you require, what the outcome of an action is. And the way I like to think about this is sort of, there are uncertainties about, on all of these dimensions, about the sort of formulation of the decision problem you face. So that's one group of sort of conditions. So the conditions are the condition is you have to be able to do this. And it's, one of the things I like to think about is what happens when we can't meet those conditions. So let's suppose, however, that we do meet these conditions, then there's still more that have to be met, and these too are sort of difficult to meet sometimes. So to apply the rule, it's not enough to identify the various states of the world. You have to be able to assess them probabilistically. And then here there's a sort of fierce debate in the literature about just how sort of easy, feasible, rational it is to do this under various kind of circumstances. So in the nice cases, you've got sort of lots of information available to you. You've got a lot of experience of situations like that. So maybe you've lived in the city for a long time, and you're thinking about what clothes to wear the next day, and so the relevant states of the world are the weather states. So, you've got some information, you can reach a reasonable assessment. Perhaps you've also listened to the weather report, that helps you. So it seems perfectly fine to make an assessment of these kinds of things. But in other situations, just transport yourself into sort of a new country, and all of that changes. You can't listen to the radio report because it's in a language you don't understand. And then how reasonable is it to have probabilities in these cases? And some people say, no, nonetheless, the right thing to do is to just do the best with the information that you've got and build some probabilities. Because to not do that would mean that you were unable to do the only thing that's rationally available to you, namely maximize expected utility. And other people, and this is sort of, the side that I'm on, say, no, that's not the only thing we can do here. We can try and sort of work with a little bit less than probabilities. Exactly the same point can be made about the evaluation of these outcomes. So, some outcomes are very easy to assess. You're sort of, you're thinking about sort of avoiding bodily harm. I think it's easy to see this as a bad thing, but how bad? Okay, it's already coming a little bit complicated. But a lot of the time we want to make decisions which involve outcomes that differ, along lots of dimensions, and involve quite complicated ethical issues in sort of reaching a verdict on these things. And so it's really hard. It's really hard to say, just how bad it is that, or comparatively even, to say how bad it is to, disappoint a friend by not making an appointment versus sort of meeting some other obligation which is causing you to be late. And balancing these things out can be very difficult. And again, you can sort of take two sides on this. One side is sort of just sort of stop whinging, make your best assessment, because you have to if you want to apply the only reasonable rule sort of thing. And the other is to say, no, well, let's see if we can work with a little bit less information than that. And so there again, sort of part of what I do is exploring the possibility of working with less information.
Okay, so could you perhaps elaborate a little bit on your views on those particular challenges?
Okay, so let me start out by sort of giving you some of my views on one which is much discussed in the literature, and then maybe I'll say a little bit about some of the others. So the version of this problem that's really been most discussed is the issue about whether we can have probabilistic assessment of the states of the world. And as I said before, I mean, my view quite firmly is that there are many occasions on which, we may in some sense be able to do it if we're forced to, but it doesn't really sort of feel like it's a reasonable thing to do, because our basis for doing so is just our evidence is too sparse. We just don't have enough experience with the situation. And many people propose that in these cases, what you move to is the next best thing, is you sort of think about adopting a range of possible probability values, perhaps even an interval or something like that, and work in your decision making with an interval like that. So I think that's the helpful first step, but it immediately gives rise to a problem, which is which interval. It seems just as hard to kind of fix on an interval of probabilities as it was to fix on a precise one, and this is a sort of complaint that many people make. So I think that still is not good enough, actually. Really, what we need to think about is sort of a range of possible interval judgments, differing in the sort of level of precision, and then for each of those sort of levels of precision, say something about how confident we are that that's the right range to be working with. So we need to make some second-order judgments about these judgments we make about the states of the world. And these two, I think, are decision relevant, and I mean, in complicated ways, but I can sort of just specify sort of very simply, when you're having to make a decision, some of the decisions you need to make are going to be very sensitive to precise features of the environment, and if there's no other way of making a choice between these two options, and you really have to make a choice, then you really have no alternative but to do your best and reach for as precise a probabilistic estimate as is necessary. But quite often, there will be alternatives available to us which are much less sensitive to these precise values, and if we're not very comfortable with the precise values, it seems reasonable to instead favor those actions which do reasonably well on whatever standard of value we're applying in the assessment of outcomes, no matter what precise value it takes. And then sort of intervals is sufficient to give us a handle on what's so let me say a little bit about sort of two other kinds of uncertainties, because some of them are sort of, well, they're different. So firstly, I would want to treat uncertainty about the outcomes, about the value of the outcomes, in a rather similar way. I mean, so again, I don't need to go into detail, because you can, if you sort of understand what it did with the probabilities, you sort of immediately see what will happen with the utilities. Again, you sort of want to look at sort of intervals of plausible values. It's a bit complicated here, because the kind of scales that we use for measuring these things are far less unique than the ones we use for the probabilities, but sort of setting that aside, the basic idea of looking at a range of plausible values is the same strategy. And then, again, looking for actions which, no matter what the sort of precise value is, we're sort of we're happy that that's a good consequence, and so we can be content with that. But these sort of problems about how to structure the state space are rather different, and these sort of things that I've said won't settle those kind of things entirely. So in particular, it doesn't settle the issue of how to get the correct problem description. This is a multi-dimensional problem. I'll simply sort of again lock on one particular instance. So I think there's a kind of way of finessing the issue about the outcome description by just thinking about the causal relationships between the actions that you want to perform and the outcomes, and treating those as objects of uncertainty too. So, in a bit more, with a bit more sort of structure here, we might sort of think, well, what we really want to think about is all the possible, sort of causally plausible relationships between the world being in a certain kind of state and the sort of outcome that can follow from that, and then have some measure of our uncertainty about that. So I think the idea is very simple, but the technicalities are quite difficult because yes, this assessment will be probabilistic, but what you're evaluating here probabilistically are not sort of states like is it raining, is it snowing, and so on. It's states like if I were to kind of take an umbrella with me, then I would not get wet. So this is this description that I've now got to assess probabilistically has the form of a kind of counterfactual. It refers to possibilities that may not actually occur. It's not clear how we get empirical evidence to support claims like that. And it's not sort of even clear what the sort of logical form of the assessment and so on. So there's a range of sort of, this is why the issue is, of course, interesting to philosophers because there's lots of sort of juicy conceptual problems involved here. But it's also sort of an issue of great practical importance because all the time when we're assessing policies, so I think sort of government agencies and so on, I mean, that's what they're doing. They're thinking about interventions that they can make in society. We could sort of increase pensions, we could sort of ban certain activities, and so on. And you want to know what would happen if you were to do this. So you have to assess those kind of counterfactuals, and you are almost certainly uncertain about them. So we really need to be able to say something relatively precise about how that should be done.
Let's consider the sorts of you were talking about big decisions with lots of uncertainty that we've been mentioning. So we're talking about pension policy, you can think about climate policy and a whole bunch of decisions like that. And suppose that you were asked for general practical advice on how uncertainty, the sorts of uncertainties you've been talking about, should be dealt with in these sorts of decisions.
So I think the important thing about policymakers is that, they have to make judgments that are sort of publicly defensible. And so there's something a lot more structured about the process of judgment here than when it's just me thinking about, which shop to go to or where to go out for dinner tonight or something like that, where I can just make a judgment. I'm not accountable to anybody except, maybe the wife and, the children and so on. So the policymaker, I think, needs to be very clear about the source of these judgments. And there are, broadly speaking, two sorts of judgments that he or she is drawing on. On the one hand, there are these judgments about the state of the world. And there, the natural thing is to rely on what science can offer. And the important thing about relying on these scientific judgments is we know that these are judgments that are assessed rigorously in a transparent environment. There's no sort of slipping in of personal bias or anything like that, because when people make claims, other people scrutinize them and so on. So they have a kind of transparency and certifiability that, and quite apart from that, of course, if I have the way in which science is set up is in such a way that we can have reasonable confidence in the sort of verdicts that it delivers about the states that we're interested in, although we might want to sort of say a bit more about that in a minute. So to a greater extent as possible, the policymaker should rely on the sort of reliable, robust information that can come out of scientific and other forms of inquiry. Then you also need values to feed into this process that will help with the assessment of the outcomes. And so I should also say that the science will be helpful too in telling you about these counterfactuals. They will also should inform you about the effects of your policy interventions. So this too relies on causal knowledge, which is not just a matter of sort of gut reaction, but can be studied, although with there are difficulties, of course, with this. So then for the purposes of the assessment of the outcomes, policymakers are in an interesting position here because it really depends now on the details of where they are, but broadly they have, they're supposed to be acting in the interests of their citizenry or their public. I mean, there will be a natural let's call them the stakeholders. These are the people that are not, have something at stake in the decision and to whom the policymaker is responsible. And I guess sort of broadly speaking, sort of democracy offers one mechanism by which sort of values are determined. And of course, these broad values have to be made specific against the consequences. But again, this needs to be sort of publicly defensible. So I think there need to be relatively explicit processes by which these judgments are made, both the probability and the sort of value judgments. Then the next thing that I would say is, policymakers should not hide the uncertainties that are involved here. So I was saying before that, in this nice case, we're confident about these probabilities, confident about the value judgments, but not all policy decisions are going to be made in the nice cases, but the decisions still have to be made. Okay, so now it becomes harder, and it becomes harder because of the amount of uncertainty that's involved. And the one thing that absolutely should be avoided is to pretend that there isn't, or to somehow delegate responsibility for the uncertainty to some other person. So recognition of the uncertainties that you face is critical here, and that's critical because it means there has to be recognition up front that the action may not turn out to be the best thing that one should do under those circumstances. I mean, life can go hard for the policymaker too. Because only if there is this sort of transparency and honesty about this process can we avoid these kind of ridiculous cycles in which policymakers may or may not, but I mean, let's be charitable, or making sort of their best, doing the best that they can with the circumstances. Things don't work out the way that they hope, and then they get hammered by the public for making the wrong decision. So there needs to be sort of a relatively sort of adult recognition that this thing's not going right is part of the process, so long as the decision's defensible in terms of how those judgments were formed. That's where the sort of criticism can come in.
What do you think are the central challenges which still remain open, or what you would prioritize when we're considering uncertainty and how to do that? Okay, so I mean, there are sort of issues that would be very interesting for philosophers to explore, and then there are sort of issues that I think are sort of crying out in the practical world, as it were, for exploration, but to which philosophers can contribute. So let me concentrate a bit on the other one. So I mean, one part of this is something that you've already raised. I mean, it's really, can we improve decision making at this kind of, at this big level where we're really dealing not with an individual who's got a set of private concerns, but we're dealing with somebody who's some body or some agency typically. I mean, it's really very infrequently a single decision maker. It's committees or structured hierarchies that are making these decisions. Can we say something about the way in which this process of decision making is organized so that this broad idea of maximizing expected benefit, which I think is a sort of solid basis on which to think about what people should do, how that can be sort of implemented in ways which best achieve that sort of kind of decision making. And I think you really at the end get down to sort of questions about institution design. Can we design institutions in such a way that we can maximize the benefit coming out of science, that we can maximize the benefit coming out of our political processes? Can we improve both of those? And can we ensure that the decision-making is guided in an appropriate way about these things? So lots of people are thinking about these things, but I think we're sort of at a point where a nice push on these things would be useful. I'm very interested in these sort of problems about very severe uncertainty. A lot of decision problems are not like that, but there are important ones here. And there's a sort of sense, I mean, some people make this point, and I think there's some sort of sense in this, is that the sort of rate of technological advance in some sense is increasing, right? Mm-hmm. So uncertainties are being sort of thrown up sort of ever more rapidly in a way. Yeah. And learning how to manage the fact that we know that technology is going to disturb the world as we understand it now is a very sort of difficult
thing to do, because by definition you don't know what's coming at you, right? So how are you supposed to think about this? It's sort of like being asked to conceive the unconceptual or the non-conceptualizable. Nonetheless, we do want to have some way of managing these things. So I think that's a really big, if exceedingly difficult challenge for decision theorists, is to deal with this problem of how do we design systems decision systems, let's say in the broader sense, not just sort of finding decision rules, that allow us to kind of manage in a sensible way the fact that we expect to be surprised in the future.
I think you've more or less talked about what your field can contribute to these sorts of challenges. Do you think these sorts of challenges require specific contributions from other fields?
Yeah, so especially these sort of things that I was talking about. So there's a certain set of sort of abstract questions about what's best to do that philosophy is well suited to, because that's what we do. We abstract from all the messy details and we think about pure cases. That's what we're good at. But once you're looking at sort of issues like institutional design, how do systems as a whole best respond to these things? It's not something that any one discipline can do in isolation. And some of these bigger policy questions involve uncertainties that span different kinds of disciplines. So we really need people who are sort of understand very well how to make use of scientific information. I mean, perhaps statisticians are a sort of good example of people who sort of study how to make use of information that we have. But it's a bit broader than that. I mean, so statistics is focused on a certain kind of information, but very broadly, sort of people who they're not doing the modeling themselves necessarily or the data gathering, but they're sort of thinking about what's the sort of inferences that one can draw on the basis of these things. I think it is also, the empirical side of decision theory is also important even to these normative issues, because, one of the things you need to think about when you're making a decision as an agent is sort of how other agents will respond. It's just no good designing policies that sort of don't take into account whether people will sort of respond to them in the way that you hope that they will respond to them. And that might even include yourself, right? So there are cases where you know stuff about yourself which makes you doubt that you'll respond to the things that you want to do in the correct way. So self-knowledge even is kind of important in this thing, and that's essentially an empirical exercise. So yes, we need to talk to psychologists, we need to talk to statisticians, we need to talk to economists. All of these things, all of these people have an important role to play in answering these sort of rather big policy-related questions in particular.
Okay. So Richard Bradley, thank you.
Well, thank you.